Stephen Wonker, who has a long record of creating successful ventures and was a long-term colleague of the leading innovation authority, Clay Christensen, who we've had speak at this conference before, in building up his consulting practice. And he now leads New Market Advisor, a firm that helps companies win in changing environments. So he blogs for Forbes and Harvard Business Review and authored the critically acclaimed book, Capturing New Markets: How Smart Companies Create Opportunities Others Don't. He holds degrees from Harvard Business School, Columbia, and Princeton. Stephen is a specialist in finding and entering new markets, the very thing we heard Ram Charan discuss this morning as key to innovation and changing the game. And he's known for his highly collaborative style that's both practical and fresh. So please welcome me in joining Stephen Wonker.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for having me here today. I realize that this is an industry in transition. I do a lot of work in healthcare, and just about every sector of healthcare is in transition. So not only are you changing, but your clients are changing for a wide host of reasons. That's what I specialize in. A lot of the work that we do is in healthcare, but more fundamentally, we're all about looking at industries in transition. What I've tried to do in the book, and what I want to do with you today, is understand what are the principles for success, as well as some of the failure watch-outs for companies in transition. How do you make the move from one business model, from one set of customer objectives, to a very different world? And I come to you speaking both as a consultant, but also as somebody who's been there on the front lines leading change. I've been a successful entrepreneur. I've been a corporate venturer. I'm sure you've heard from entrepreneurs before, and they love to regale you with their success stories. I actually want to begin by telling you a personal story, and it's not a story about one of the 5 companies that I've created, but rather a story of failure, probably the biggest failure of my professional career. About a dozen years ago, I was at a company called Scion PLC. It's the leading British consumer electronics company. It's actually the company that invented the PDA back in the 1980s. Well, in 1999, we wanted to move from PDAs into smartphones, and I was the person tasked with leading that effort. We created a joint venture with Ericsson that actually produced one of the world's first mobile internet devices, as well as a joint venture with Motorola that was designated with creating one of the first smartphones. Here's a picture of the device. As you can see, it looks like a smartphone that you might have seen reasonably recently, pre-iPhone, but maybe around 2006 or so. And we actually had, this was a working prototype. You see a map going there. We could imagine all the instances in which people might want to use a smartphone, and we were designing a device for that future. But we had 2 problems. The first was that consumers weren't there yet. They weren't using social messaging, social networking. They weren't really messaging that much, certainly in the United States. They weren't using any applications. Those didn't exist. They weren't used to using their geographical position with their phone or to uncover opportunities around them. And so we were trying to create a product before the market was ready. But even more problematic for a technology company is that we were trying to integrate components before all the technologies were fully baked. The technologies in and of themselves barely worked, but when you stitched them together and tried to integrate a package, it was extremely technologically demanding. Now, while we were trying to work through those challenges, there were a lot of Motorola engineers on this project, and they would be in the rooms, and they weren't talking about this future that we were creating. They instead were doing something very different. They were using this ugly, cheap, black plastic device to send messages back and forth to each other. And this offended our sensibilities very much. This was not a high-end device. It wasn't a technologically cutting-edge device. It was a simple messaging platform. And I just wish they would put away that messaging device and concentrate on creating the future. So you know how that story ends, right? The future was right in front of me had I known how to look for it. A company at the same time called Research in Motion came out with the BlackBerry. The BlackBerry was essentially the same thing as that device. It was a two-way pager. It wasn't even a cell phone initially. And all it was good for was sending messages. But it sent messages very, very well. And it was laser targeted on a foothold market of corporate executives who were addicted to their emails. They latched onto it. They made BlackBerry their early leader in the smartphone industry. And in fact, up until 2007, BlackBerry remained a leader in the smartphone industry, which is an eon for that industry in particular. So they were able to capture the future, even though they were this nothing startup from Canada. And we had all these technological assets, great brand names, fantastic teams of engineers. We weren't able to do that. Why? So I'll point to 3 reasons. First of all, the strategy that you have can become a blinder. We were used to selling complicated, prestigious, expensive, high-margin devices. Going from that sort of world into this cheap, ugly, low-margin, not even a phone, not even a PDA sort of world was offensive to our sensibilities and was certainly contrary to the corporate strategies that both Motorola had as well as Scion. Secondly, business models ossify. The technology might be out there. It might be readily accessible even. But to change a business model to suit new technologies or even new customer mandates can be fiendishly difficult to accomplish. So for Motorola in particular, they were prioritizing selling to mobile carriers like Verizon and Vodafone. A paging device was not sold to a mobile carrier. In fact, it competed with mobile carriers. So this was profoundly uninteresting to them. But thirdly, most importantly, most insidiously, values become dogma. So in the UK, there aren't a lot of consumer electronics companies. Scion had its pick of the best electrical and mechanical engineers. We had a fantastic group of people working for us. People who were intensely proud to come to work at a leading British company, a company that created the PDA category. They prided themselves on making high-end, cutting-edge devices. To ask one of those engineers to prioritize instead this beastly monstrosity that the Motorola engineers wanted to use was something that they just were not going to do. And so even though there might not have been even a conscious decision that we weren't going to go in the direction of the Motorola two-way paging device, these decisions would get made instead in very small increments on an everyday basis because of the values that people brought with them to work. And because values are unstated, because oftentimes they're not written down, you don't recognize the obstacle that they can present to change. Now, I see these obstacles rising again and again in the healthcare industry. Pharma companies, device companies pride themselves on cutting-edge therapies, new molecules, and oftentimes those can deliver a lot of value. But equally, a lot of the possibility for better medical outcomes, better economic outcomes, isn't in the device. It's not in the molecule. It's in things like adherence and lifestyle modification and getting people to the position when they're on the cusp of an exacerbation. Fairly unglamorous sorts of activities, but ones with a very big payoff if you can get it right, and as many of the sessions at this conference have talked about, ones that increasingly people are interested in generating data around because that is a real-world situation, unlike what gets submitted to FDA for approval. Now, one possible outcome of confronting a need for transition is illustrated by Kodak. It's a story you're familiar with, I'm sure. In the 1990s, Kodak was riding high. Silver halide film had profit margins exceeding 90%. This was a great business. And then slowly the company started to decline and eventually it started falling off a cliff. Now, this was caused first by digital imaging. And the irony of this is that Kodak actually invented the digital camera back in 1975. I've spoken with the person who invented it, and he said that very quickly after he invented it, he was called into a board meeting to demonstrate the device, and the board looked on with keen interest, and then the person spoke up and said, "That's cute. Now, don't ever show that to anybody ever again." So you can ignore the future until it's too late. You can then try to rush into what you think the future is, which is what Kodak did. They invested billions of dollars to create a decent digital camera, and eventually they succeeded. But ironically, once they finally succeeded making that transition, they were missing the next transition, which was to cell phones. Today, the world's biggest digital camera manufacturer is Nokia. So they missed the boat not once, but twice. Now, frequently, when you see a big company do that, they won't just fade into irrelevance, but they'll try to make a handful of big swing for the fences attempts to right the ship. And Kodak did that as well, not just in making digital cameras, but in putting photo kiosks into drugstores. Kodak had this vision that if you went to a drugstore, you might want to download the pictures from your phone and get prints right there. These kiosks cost about $10,000 each, and they put them in thousands upon thousands of drugstores. And unfortunately for Kodak, people actually didn't want to do that. HP placed a much smaller bet, an earlier bet, on printers that were capable of printing photos. And HP cleaned up, while Kodak eventually tried copying HP, but by then, by the third attempt, it was far too late. So by ignoring the future, Kodak missed several opportunities to make much smaller bets. Instead, it had to force itself into making these giant attempts, which very frequently end up, as they have for Kodak, in bankruptcy. So that's one example of how a company deals with transition, not a very happy example. There's a much happier ending, though, for another technological behemoth, which is IBM. Now, IBM also had a moment of reckoning. Its moment came earlier, around 1992. This is a graph of the stock price from 1987 to 1992. You can see the price almost halved. They got rid of their CEO. You got the business press piling in. This is a quote from Business Week back in '93 that IBM resembles a flailing giant trying to extricate itself from an outmoded strategy. It's amazing. You could cut and paste that quote for so many different industries and leaders in those industries. The problem, the irony here, is that what makes a company great initially often imprisons it in adjusting to the future. It's the same thing that happened at Scion. We became so proud of what we did that we couldn't make the transition to the new. Now, fortunately for IBM, they took a very hard look in the mirror. And they tried to understand, what are they good at? And even more importantly, what do their customers need? And they brought in a fresh perspective. They brought in Lou Gerstner as an outside CEO, and they transformed the company. So this is a graph of the same 5-year period, but now extended out to the present. And you see that dip around 1992. Gerstner comes in, and you see this reinvigoration of the $100 billion plus company. So it becomes something very different than what it used to be. Whereas in 1992, analysts were saying that IBM was stuck in a commoditizing industry. It was selling boxes where the margins were going down, and there wasn't a lot of prospect for the future of the industry. They realized that people still had very important unmet IT needs, but they weren't for boxes. They weren't for point solutions. They were for overarching solutions, integrated solutions. And critically, ones that may not even involve IBM's technology. IBM just wasn't a sales organization claiming to sell a solution, but really just trying to push out as many IBM boxes as possible. It would partner with a wide array of firms and deliver to clients what they actually needed. And that's a very relevant example for you, right? This whole conference is about partnerships. It's about helping companies that may be in pharma, may be in devices, definitely lack a suite of competencies that are needed to succeed in a solutions world, in a disease state management world. But to a large extent, through partnerships, they can actually create that sort of future. So the same publication, Business Week, writes in 2011, now they've mastered the art of developing the next generation. They have a problem of riches as opposed to the problem of poverty. Let's look again at Kodak. We talked about them in the 1990s. We talked about them in the 2000s. Let's look at the 80s, but the 1880s, and the inception of Kodak, when George Eastman invented celluloid film and created the Kodak company. Eastman was an amateur. He initially dabbled in photography because he planned to take a trip to the Dominican Republic, which actually never happened. And he wanted to learn how to take a picture. And he came to recognize that this was a highly dysfunctional industry. Photography had been invented in France back in the 1820s, and so it had a 60-year track record. Most of the cameras in Eastman's day looked like this. They were big contraptions. They were complicated. They were expensive. Moreover, there wasn't celluloid film. The way you exposed a picture was to take it onto a glass plate. So these were bulky, big, fragile things, and they had to be developed immediately after you made the exposure. So the photographer not only needed to know how to compose an image, but he had to carry with him a small chemistry set in order to make the image come alive immediately. Now, for the past 60 years, people had been trying to innovate in making the image higher and higher quality. And one way to do that was to increase the size of the camera. But they also wanted to make the camera portable, so it could actually go out to where the action is. One of the tragedies about photography in the 19th century is we have pictures of Abraham Lincoln, photographic portraits of Abraham Lincoln, but we don't have a lot of photos of the Civil War, because the Civil War didn't happen to happen in the photography studio. So you got machines that look like this, which I guess technically are portable, and they were big, so they had better quality resolution. But it didn't really solve the problem of unlocking consumption. People were still innovating along very traditional metrics of performance, of picture quality and portability. And ultimately you ended up with things like this, which I guess technically is portable because it's outside, but it's certainly not the sort of thing you're going to be carting around onto the battlefield. Was very big, and so it had a good image quality, but didn't make photography accessible to the masses. In short, you had an industry which was complicated and centralized and costly, and because of that, it was constrained. Now you can level those same charges, those 3C charges, against much of the healthcare industry. Not only in emerging countries, but also in the United States. There are so many solutions that might theoretically work, but don't happen because healthcare is complicated, centralized, and costly. And we don't have clinical evidence about efficacy in situations where we don't have that paradigm. Because when we're doing a lot of clinical trials, we don't terribly care about if it's done at an academic medical center, or if there are highly skilled providers out there, or these are very expensive providers to have in what would ultimately be a real-world situation. It's changing, but that's historically a real weakness. Eastman looked at this situation, and he created a breakthrough on 3 different fronts. First of all, as I mentioned, he created celluloid film. So finally, this film was portable, and it didn't need to be developed immediately after the picture was exposed. And he created the Eastman Kodak Company, and he launched the celluloid film with enormous fanfare, and it flopped. The problem was that the film was not of the same sort of quality as glass plates. So the traditional audience for photography, the traditional consumers of photography, were uninterested. This didn't deliver picture quality, and it also didn't leverage the expertise that they had accumulated over many years in being skilled practitioners of chemistry. Does this sound like specialists in the healthcare world? And so Eastman had to develop a new business model to make celluloid film more popular. And he hit upon an idea whereby he would sell people a camera preloaded with film for 100 images. You expose the images, and then you sent the whole camera back to Rochester, New York. The film would get developed there. You would get the camera reloaded with film and with your 100 images printed. This was encapsulated in what is still regarded as one of the best advertising slogans of all time. You press the button, we do the rest. Now this was a mild success, but it still didn't really catch on. The problem was that the way people bought photography was through corner shops. And these corner shops existed because in the world of glass plates, you were not going to be ordering a glass plate through the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Predictably, the corner shops hated the idea of celluloid film. This would put them out of business. And so they weren't giving Eastman a channel to market. Now he was lucky because at the same time that he was creating the technological and business model innovations, you had this explosion of periodicals in the United States, like the Saturday Evening Post or newspapers. And so he was able to place ads targeting the consumer directly. And once he was able to put together these three legs of the stool, the technology and the business model and the channel, then everything came together quite quickly. Within a few years, he had 50% of the photography business. The industry had expanded vastly, and of course he created a franchise which went on to dominate its industry for the next 110 years, one of the great success stories in business history. A company in your industry has recently grappled with a similar sort of reinvention. So Walgreens is a pharmacy. It has a store at the front, but the profit engine for Walgreens is the pharmacy. And that is a problem, because Walgreens has been assailed on two different fronts. On the one hand, you have PBMs like Express Scripts, who are heavily pushing mail order. And Express Scripts, Medco, these folks have just a lower cost structure than a bricks and mortar retailer. They're able to sell drugs for less. And then on the other side, you've got the happy people at Walmart, who are giving away $4 generics to try to get people into the store and make money off of them in other ways. Ways that Walgreens can't because they simply have a smaller retail footprint. And so Walgreens knew it had to reinvent itself, reinvent what the pharmacy was and how they created value in the healthcare system. Now, they could have done a pell-mell acquisition campaign with all sorts of unrelated healthcare companies, but they thought long and hard about what is their advantage in healthcare. And they ultimately came down to two key strategic criteria, which would be the rudder for their reinvention campaign. First, they excelled at managing dispersed workforces, and they had a lot of physical assets around the country, 7,000 stores, which would facilitate the outreach of their company to be a face-to-face point of contact with patients and other people in the healthcare world. Secondly, they needed to make sure that they were not going to be cut out of health plans. The concern was that major health insurers would mandate people would have mail order pharmacy and would not reimburse for going to a Walgreens. So they had to make themselves indispensable to health plans. Now, they ended up pursuing those objectives in four distinct ways. They bought the number one and the number two providers of workplace health clinics. So they provided primary care at the work site for large factories or other fairly big employers. This made them indispensable to employers, tightly integrated in with the way employers actually consumed healthcare. Secondly, and relatedly, they moved aggressively into the market for retail clinics, take-care clinics at Walgreens. This not only served to bring people into the store, where Walgreens could make money off them in a variety of ways, but it was very synergistic with the workplace business as well. Dependents could go to the take-care clinics. Employees out of working hours could go to the take-care clinics. Walgreens had an advantage in serving employers that the rivals in the workplace clinic business lacked, because it had the bricks and mortar footprint at so many establishments around the country. Third, it took this hidden jewel, pharmacists, well-trained, highly compensated individuals who were being underutilized, basically sticking labels on bottles, and it redeployed them in a new way. It moved a lot of the, what it calls lick-em-stick-em, off-site to central facilities, and used the pharmacists to provide disease counseling, both over the counter and even in half-an-hour encounters in side rooms next to the pharmacy, where they would look over all the medications a patient was on. They would suggest therapeutic substitution. They would explain what each drug does. They would try to make it very clear what the regimen should do, and they would even talk about things like diet and exercise and smoking, other key adjuncts to pharmaceutical therapy. And then last, they made a major play in the home healthcare business, focusing particularly on infusions. So they would actually visit people in the home and deliver the infusion, providing a face-to-face point of contact with the healthcare system for them. So in innumerable ways, making themselves almost impossible to cut out of a health plan, almost impossible for an employer to drop, and leveraging their competencies. And they've done this very, very successfully. Walgreens looked at the market not in terms of what people were asking for, which was very traditional stuff in terms of, well, I want my pharmacy to fill the script accurately or be quick and have a clean store. And it didn't see its competitors in very traditional means as well. Sure, CVS was a competitor, but it wondered about what more broadly was the opportunity, as well as what more broadly was the competition. Now, I worked for 5 years with Clayton Christensen, as Deidre mentioned. He's a professor at Harvard Business School, and one of his enduring legacies is creating a theory that he calls jobs to be done. That really successful companies don't sell stuff to people. They help people get jobs done. And by looking broadly, you can reframe your industry and uncover huge growth opportunities in markets that may seem static if you take a what perspective. Instead, you need to ask why. So patients would say, don't make me feel sick. Employers would say, lower my overall healthcare costs. Make sure that people have less time away from work. And there your competition is much broader. But equally, the market you can play for is much broader as well. So Walgreens took a very disciplined way in how it outlined the jobs. Couldn't address all of the jobs, didn't want to address all of the jobs. It had its strategic rudder already in place, but it knew what the overall landscape of opportunity was. When you think about the types of innovation that you can produce, understanding the jobs that the market wants to get done, there's actually 10 different types. And apologies, maybe you in the back might have a difficulty reading this, but it goes all the way from business models through to customer experience. And this is outlined in an article I co-wrote with Monitor Group called Beacons for Business Model Innovation. So if any of you want to get the graphic, you can just Google Beacons for Business Model Innovation. What the folks at Monitor did was look at 5,000 innovations. And they charted how they aligned with this graphic, with the 10 different types of innovation. And they looked at the return on investment. Now, most companies focused in the middle of the spectrum. They focused on product performance and the product system. And sadly, what we find for most companies is a rather dismal result. In fact, of the 5,000 innovations, on average, the return on investment was 4.5%. Pathetically awful numbers. And yet, of those 5,000, there were 100 innovations, 2%, that created over 90% of the cumulative value. All of those 100 innovations were anchored at the ends of the spectrum. They innovated both the business model and the customer experience, and they innovated at least 4 other variables as well. Now that is hard to do, but because it's hard to do, it's exceedingly profitable if you can get it right. Pharma's trying to do that. The med device industry is trying to do that. Increasingly, just about every big pharma company I know is working on Pill Plus initiatives, and increasingly that's the case in the device world as well. Why are they trying to do this? Well, they want to drive diagnosis. They want to drive people into therapies. They want to make sure that people are adherent, both to sell more pills as well as to get the results that they've claimed they can achieve. They want to differentiate. They want to stand out not just by being the 4th drug in a therapeutic area, but by having some sort of program that adds value in a distinct way. They want to integrate themselves into physician practices, not just through dropping off samples or giving pizza, but by really becoming a partner with the physician in patient care. And then have outcomes, and this is the part that's most critical for you. They want to have outcomes that demonstrate to payers why they should achieve the levels of reimbursement that they're asking for. And that means real-world outcomes for a disease state, not idealized outcomes versus a placebo for a pill. So this has very big impacts on your industry. As several speakers elsewhere in the conference have talked about, this is about real-world populations. Comorbid, might have cognitive impairment, might have limited access to a physician, might be older, might be sicker than a lot of the idealized populations that you're going to have in your FDA filings. Real-world circumstances. You want to improve adherence, but you also have to deal with populations that are non-adherent. There are many disease states where 50% adherence is actually a pretty good showing. So what happens in the effectiveness of a therapy or of a disease state solution when people are only 50 or 60% adherent to a drug or other sort of intervention? Leverage EMR data in new ways, not just for pharmacovigilance, but to add in detail, in a lot of detail, who is the population of responders and not. Can you develop an individualized perspective on what sort of therapies and overall interventions are going to work for a particular person? So much of clinical development is about averages. You're looking at populations. You're trying to characterize people broadly. You're not saying, okay, for this particular individual, we know this about their lifestyle, we know, this about their other conditions and their history, and therefore we're going to make a very specific recommendation. Now, that's the future, right? This is not next year. And yet, if you can do that, you can have outcomes that are dramatically better than talking about averages and providing point solutions, and therefore you can justify levels of reimbursement which are dramatically higher than you might be able to do otherwise. And then last, you need to develop this disease state solution. And for so many disease states, particularly the high-value disease states, it's not just about a pill, right? It's about lifestyle modification, it's about adherence, all sorts of things that go into achieving outcomes that oftentimes are at least as effective as switching from one drug to another or inserting a device. Now, I've worked on a lot of these initiatives, both with drug companies and device companies. And there's a lot of roadkill out there. There's a lot of people who have struggled to make this happen. Not because the vision is implausible, but because it's so hard to get done in a big company that's proud of where it's come from. One of the most essential ingredients for success, I found, is to have a very clear strategy about what you're doing. Not a Walgreens level strategy of trying to avoid being cut out of a health plan, but a very specific strategy for your particular initiative. In particular, is this a drug marketing effort or is it a new line of business? There's no one right answer to that question. It's going to vary by therapeutic area. But it is critical to answer early, and yet a lot of companies don't. So relatedly, are you going to make this service or integrated offering available to people who are not on your drug, who don't have your device implanted? Do we want others to copy us? Is this primarily something that we're doing for demonstration purposes to change clinical practice? Or is this something proprietary that we want to make very specific to people only on our therapy? Once you make those strategic decisions, you can then reflect that in your organizational structure. Does this sit within drug marketing? Is this a brand program? Or is this a separate entity? Or does it sit somewhere else in the organization? And then most relevant to you, you can define the outcomes that you need to generate the evidence for the target customers that you have. And those customers might be very different than some of your historic customers in the industry. We have here a quote from Kim Park at Janssen talking about one other really critical variable that has bedeviled a lot of pharma as well as device companies. You don't have exclusivity. You live in this fuzzy world where we don't know what the competition is going to be. We don't know what the industry is going to look like. And yet so many companies impose these rules from the legacy business. We need a 10-year NPV on a disease state solution for, you name it, asthma, heart failure. How are you possibly going to do that and not be writing a work of fiction? There needs to be another approach. You can't just hold up your hands and say, I give up. Really, what the CEO wants to know is, can this be big enough? Can this be profitable enough to matter? So instead of creating these very precise estimates, which are completely bogus, you can instead create what Clayton Christensen and others call a reverse income statement. Let's start with does this need to be a $100 million business, a $500 million business, and then let's work backwards to what are the handful of drivers of attaining those sorts of outcomes. Let's focus attention not on the projections, which are fictional, but on the assumptions, which are things that we can actually look at now and do something about. So we've covered a lot of ground. I want to summarize this in 7 points. If you hear yourself talking about old strategies and business model and values, and using that lens to assess new markets, new ventures, new spaces, beware. Turn on that self-editor and try to think about it as an entrepreneur might, or even more as the marketplace might, and not with your legacy. Ultimately, you need to be cognizant of the legacy. But when you look at the market opportunity, think about what actually the marketplace demands, not the fact that you used to sell widgets and so you're looking for more opportunities for widget consumption. Think about consumption constraints. This is one of the great growth areas in healthcare. Even for people may complain about the cost of pharma, may complain about the cost of devices, but it is often dramatically cheaper to be on the right script with the right implant than to have an event and run up a $20,000 hospital bill. Integrate technologies, business models, and partnerships like George Eastman did. Think about the 3 different legs of the stool that need to come together to really make a new market blossom. Think carefully about your hidden jewels, like Walgreens did. What are you good at? Now, you don't want to think just about core competency. That's like driving by looking only in the rearview mirror. But you need to be cognizant of it, and you need to marry that with what are the strategic imperatives, both to defend your core business and to grow in ways that leverage your assets in intelligent ways. What are the jobs to be done in your marketplace? Of course, in healthcare, we have many different sorts of customers. What are all the different sorts of jobs they have? Take an expansive view about what the marketplace demands, then back into what you can actually supply, either as your own company or via partnerships. Think about the ends of the spectrum, not just the middle, not just the product or the service that you're selling, but the customer experience and the business model. How can those be innovated in ways that create something which is really differentiated and which can unlock a whole lot of value? And then finally, have a very clear strategy about what it is exactly that you're trying to get done. I have seen so much blood spilt over decisions which in hindsight shouldn't have been made, but were because there wasn't a clear strategy in place. There might be some awkward conversations early on. Have those up front when it's very cheap to have those conversations. Those will provide infinitely useful guidance later on as ventures get commercialized. This is the book. I hope you have a chance to read it, and I'll be available after the session for any questions that you might have. Thank you.